Welcome to today's video where I am going to be going over the chemistry concepts that we reviewed today during the Kahoot. So I am making this video before we are doing the Kahoot, so I hope that as you're watching this, you are reveling in how much chemistry you still know and not saying, haha, I got 3 out of the 20 questions right. So anyways, this is going to serve as the little background that you need for the chemistry for anatomy. Okay, so chapter 2 is all the chemistry background that you need, plus the macromolecules. So these are all these concepts are going to play roles throughout the year. So it's really important to get this stuff down now. So in terms of today, what you should be doing is taking notes. And I will give you credit for those notes. And you're going to use those notes whenever we are in class tomorrow. Okay, so let's start off. So the first part of chapter 2, chemistry. And I know what you're thinking. I thought I was done with chemistry. Well, chemistry plays a major role in anatomy and really any life science. Chemistry is the basis of life. It's important for us to know these chemical concepts so that we can understand the structures which get built up through chemical reactions, and those structures are going to have certain functions that are dependent upon those structures. So first, starting very basic, talking about matter, which is anything that has weight and takes up space. So it is something. That brings us to the periodic table of elements, which there are 118 of them. We're going to talk about probably about 10, 15 this year. Not a whole lot of this, okay? But things like carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, calcium, potassium, sodium, nitrogen, phosphorus, all of these things, they play important roles in the human body, okay? So each of these elements, they have a chemical symbol, which is just an abbreviation that has 1 or 2 letters. So you always capitalize the first, and you always have the second letter as lowercase. Every atom has an atomic number, which refers to how many protons and electrons that an atom of that element will have. And each of them will also, every atom has an atomic mass, which is really just the equivalent to the amount of protons and neutrons that the atom has. Okay, so here's a nice bigger picture here that feel free to print that out. Okay, so our atom is the smallest complete unit of an element, as we learned about in the organization of the human body back in chapter 1. So an atom includes the nucleus, which has protons and neutrons, as well as an electron cloud around it. So the protons and neutrons are here in a central, it's a dense area called the nucleus. The protons, it's important to note, have a positive charge, whereas the neutrons have no charge. Then each of the electron particles, they have a negative charge that is equivalent to the positive charge from a proton, okay? So the amount of negative charge here is equal to the amount of positive charge in one of these protons. So now we're going to talk about some variations of an atom. So the first is an isotope, and an isotope is an atom of a certain element. So let's think of having 2. Both of these atoms are the same element, so they have the same protons and electrons. However, they differ in the number of neutrons that they can have. So some isotopes are more stable than others. Some are very unstable. And certain radioactive isotopes can release radiation in the form of three different things here. Okay, so a gamma radiation would be like a gamma ray or an X-ray. Beta radiation is equal to one high energy electron. And then an alpha particle is equal to two protons and two neutrons, which is the nucleus of a helium atom. Okay, so going from here, from alpha down to beta down to gamma, we're going from lowest energy to highest energy. So the gamma rays are very high energy. So they can penetrate a lot more than the alpha or the beta particles can. Okay, an ion is like an isotope, but instead of neutrons, we're talking about electrons. So an atom is going to have the same number of electrons as protons. However, an ion would differ in that it has different number of electrons. So an atom, if it gains an electron or if it loses an electron or more than one, will become an ion. So when it does that, it will become electrically charged. So if it loses an electron, well, that means that now we have more protons than electrons. So it's going to be positive. If it gains an electron, it's going to have more electrons than protons. So it is going to be negative. So like what we have here, sodium gives the electron. So now it is positive. Chlorine takes the electron. So it'll be negative. Okay, so some notable ions that I want you to know. So ions are very important for muscle contraction and action potentials, which are the communication that go down a neuron. So here we have a muscle fiber where calcium is very important for the functioning and the contraction of the muscle fiber. Okay, now over here, your neurons have a potential, which means that there's more negative charge on one side and more positive charge on the other. So that potential is built by the placement of sodium, chlorine, potassium, as well as some other minor ions. But when this message is being sent, the sodium ions are rushing into the cell and the potassium ions are rushing out of the cell. So that's important to note. So an ionic bond, which is kind of less important for us here because ions are going to be in solution within your blood and cellular fluid. However, you do have ionic bonds that form within your bones because of like calcium phosphate and other things like that. Okay, so an ionic bond forms between the attraction of a positively charged ion and a negatively charged ion. So there's no sharing of ions here. It's just the really strong attraction that occurs between two oppositely charged ions. A covalent bond is where the electrons are shared. So the example here is hydrogen. Hydrogen wants one more electron, so it gets that by forming a bond with another hydrogen or perhaps another atom. Okay, so in here we have an H2 molecule, which has two hydrogen atoms sharing two electrons. So now both of them are happy because both of them have two electrons. Okay, but in things like carbon can actually form a single, double, or a triple bond. So it can share more than just one electron with another carbon or another atom. A molecule is when you have two or more atoms that are covalently bonded together. A compound is a molecule that has different types of atoms, okay, at least two different types. So we can have a molecule here that is not a compound, like with O2 or H2, where they're both made up of the same atoms. However, when we get down to compound, we need to have at least two different atoms that make up that molecule. Okay, so we could have water or carbon dioxide where we have hydrogen and oxygen or carbon and oxygen. So a compound, we could be talking about a covalently bonded molecule, but we could also be talking about like this salt lattice here between ionic so an ionic compound, so between those charged ions. Okay, very, very important concept here. So we're going to use water as our example. So if we have two atoms that they both want electrons, however, one wants those electrons more than the other. So they differ in what is called electronegativity. So one is going to pull on those electrons a lot harder than the other, and as a result, there's an imbalance in the charge. So the one that pulls harder is going to hold the electrons closer to it, so that makes it negatively charged, and then the one that doesn't really care as much about the electrons will hold it farther away from it, and as a result, it becomes positively charged. So the one with the electrons closer becomes partially negative because of the location of those electrons, whereas the positive one becomes positive because those electrons are farther away from it. Okay, so the electron that it's sharing is farther away from it. So polarity will allow us to have attractions between polar molecules. So you can think of it similarly to an ionic attraction, but these are weaker, okay, because they're not fully charged. Okay, you don't have a full +1 or a full +2. It's less than 1. Okay, I misspoke there. It's not +1 or -1, it's going to be less than +1 or less than -1. So as a result, you have these attractions that are weaker than an ionic bond, but they can still be strong. Okay, so hydrogen bonds that occur between water molecules, between the negative oxygen and the positive hydrogen, all right, that's going to hold them closer together. So that produces things like surface tension, and some other various characteristics of water that are unusual for molecules. Okay. Chemical reactions. So we have a few different ones. Synthesis is when we have two smaller things that bond to form something larger. Okay, we could even have two or more smaller things that form a larger molecule. So this is our example here. A plus B yields AB. So two smaller things yield a larger thing. Decomposition is the opposite, where we have a larger molecule that splits, so bonds are being broken, and now we have two smaller molecules, or atoms, or ions. An exchange reaction is kind of like a combination of the other two, where we're breaking the bonds between A, B, and C, D here, but then we're forming a new bond between, so we're basically exchanging the components of each of these for a component of the other. So A will break up with B to get with D, and then C will break up with D to get with B. All right, so basically the bond is being broken so that a different bond can be formed with a different molecule or atom. Okay, and then finally a reversible reaction, you'll notice that there's a double arrow here, shows us, okay, well, A and B can combine to give us AB, but AB can also split and give us A and B separately. All right, so it can work both ways. Okay, so one of the last concepts in chapter 2 are acids and bases. So an acid is a substance that will release hydrogen ions into water. So for example, hydrochloric acid, which is one of the main components of your stomach acid, okay, will release hydrogen ions in solution, whereas a base, when it is introduced to a solution, will kind of like eat up those hydrogen ions. So an acid increases the hydrogen ions, bases decrease the hydrogen ions. So the example here is sodium hydroxide, which will split up, and then the OH minus here will combine with the H plus to form water. So this it's 2 steps, but eventually it takes out the hydrogen ions from the solution. pH is the measurement of acidity. So pH is a measurement of the concentration of hydrogen ions in the solution. So it is inversely proportional, and it is logarithmic, which means that a difference in 1 pH means that the solution is 10 times more or less acidic than what it was before. So a change in pH of 1 means that it becomes 10 more acidic or less acidic. Now, if it's changing 2, then that would be 10 to the second, so that it'd be 100 times more acidic than the original solution. Okay, so it is inversely related. So the lower the pH, the higher the amount of hydrogen ions. So the more acidic it will be. And then finally, a very important component of things like your blood and your cellular fluid is that they are buffered. So that means that they have chemicals that will be able to not only take up hydrogen ions that are introduced to the solution, but they can also donate hydrogen ions to the solution. So a buffered solution can resist changes in pH. So some of the examples, like especially with your blood, is bicarbonate. So the presence of carbon dioxide will give us bicarbonate, but there's also phosphate as well as proteins, which have the ability to both give off hydrogen ions and take in hydrogen ions. Okay, so depending on which way it goes, these solutions can resist the change in pH by reacting in one of those 2 ways. Okay, that is all for today. So we will start with organic macromolecules later in the week. But for today, make sure that you have watched this whole video, understood this whole video, and have some notes going into tomorrow.